Ready.
Yeah, good. Well, I'll call everything to order then. We're ready to go because I can't wait to get the presentation from Terry. So, Carla, I'm assuming the press has been notified. Not hearing any objections.
It has.
Yes.
It has, Sam.
And then I'm assuming, do we have any public participation? Assuming none, we'll move it on and let Terry take it away.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Terry Hilton, the Managing Director of the Multifamily Programs under Wendy. Just wanted to give you all an update of what we're doing this year. So as you all know, our Qualified Allocation Plan, our QAP, runs on a 2-year cycle, and this is at the end of our 2 years. As you know, new units are on the rise. It's desperately needed, and of course, our funding sources are, not going up. So we have put out an RFP earlier this year for a consultant to come in to look at our QAP, to look at our policies, our scoring criteria, how we divide our credits with doing preservation or new construction. So, and how can we take those credits and make more units since we're not getting any more resources? So through that process, Mark Shelburne with Novogradac was selected. He is not new to KHC, and I'm sure he's not new to you all. He's had done this for several HFAs throughout the states, throughout the country. Novogradac is a very well-known accounting firm, very much involved in housing credits, taxes and bonds, all of that. So we did have Mark meet with our outside partners earlier this year, or actually probably this month, to get some feedback from our partners as far as, highlights. What can we do to make this process or make our credits go further to get more units across the state?
When you say partners, you mean the people who submit proposals and build?
With our developers, with our financial, the bankers, through our coalition, the Kentucky Housing Coalition, through Tiffany Marthaler. We were able to set up several meetings with Mark to talk with them. So I think there were about 3 meetings that Mark had with them, with that whole membership. And so he has got some good feedback, some comments. KHC was not a part of those meetings, so we felt like it was a good chance for them to really be candid with their comments without us being there. Not that our developers are not candid with their comments, but we just wanted it to be a more relaxed atmosphere for them. With that, I'll let Mark talk to you about some of the highlights that he's come back with, of what we can do with our QAP this year.
Very good, thank you. So I put into the chat what I consider to be the top topics for us to discuss and consider as a result of this feedback, the interviews and discussions we had. And I also just have to give credit to KHC staff. I've been doing this work since 2015 for third parties, and I've been have worked for both the agencies in North Carolina and Georgia. So combined, I've worked on about 40 QAPs over the last roughly 20 years. And in all that time, never has anyone thought of this idea of having an outside consultant meet with participants without the agency present. So that was a neat. Maybe someone's done that before at some point, but if so, I've never heard of it. So I'm thinking it maybe not. So that was a neat concept to do.
And Mark, if I can jump in, we got a lot of feedback from our developers and bankers that they appreciated having a anonymous venue to be able to talk about their thoughts, concerns, and ideas.
Indeed. So there was a tremendous amount of feedback of substantially more than we could even really cover in the time we have today. And so this is really meant to be the highlights, the top issues for which I understand this group has some degree of responsibility. I apologize for not knowing all of KHC's internal roles and responsibilities. That's something I look forward to learning here as we go forward, because we're still actually pretty early on in the process. And so, but this meeting was coming up and wanted to let you guys know again what was going on. So these are the main topics. I'll just walk through them, but I would absolutely invite any input, comments, questions, thoughts as we go. This is not meant to be a speech by me, but a discussion amongst all of us. So and these are basically in order of appearance in the QAP. And so the first is this question of how much of the state's limited housing credit resource goes to rehabilitation projects versus new construction. And that the goal among many is to increase unit production across the state, because to respond to the tremendous need and that makes sense as a growing state. That would be less important in some other states where the population is shrinking or stagnant, but Kentucky's growing. And so that makes a lot of sense to have more new production. And so the question here is how much should go to which use? And it would be very reasonable to shift what has been the split to a new different split. And I've come up with some initial recommendations based on my discussion so far, and I'll share some of those with you as we go through. And they're just my initial thoughts. What ends up happening is entirely up to KHC. I'm just an idea person. And so, but my suggestion for this is to change it to where 90% of your resources go to new construction and 10% go to rehabilitation. And so there's no magic to that number. That's just what makes sense to me. But there are certainly some other states that have that or similar approaches.
Can I just ask?
Please.
Would that also have a positive impact on fair housing distribution?
Well,
if we didn't just rehab in the same old areas?
That is, there are some people who would come to that conclusion and make that argument. It's entirely debatable, though. And so that's I've been, the notion of how to use the housing credit to advance fair housing has been to varying degrees, hot topic since at least 2002, 2003. At least that's when I started following it. And the more I learn, the more I realize it's really complicated. Anyone that says, "Oh, this is exactly what should happen. This is what fair housing mandates," they're kind of wrong, or they have an agenda. And
I would add, Kathy, our most recent analysis of impediments points to just the sheer shortage of affordable units as a key impediment. And we know that, right? There's not enough supply, so it means that the folks with more advantages or discrimination lose out in a competition for scarce units. So at a minimum, us focusing on new development should help in that way. I can't promise that the geographic location will always work out optimally, but it definitely should help in that way.
Can I ask one more question about this split? Because I'm not opposed at all. I just want to know. And I'm happy to hear, the correct answer as you're giving it. Thank you. Not what you think I want to hear. By doing new, is it typical that more is needed per unit for new units than for rehab? So we would have fewer, but we would have more. So
we would have more supply. Fewer units financed, but more supply. Yeah. I don't want to make it seem like I'm objecting. I just want to make sure I understand. In fact, I think new units is the way to go, but I know there's a lot more you want to present, but the new and rehab presents these.
And Kathy, keep in mind, this goes back to what Wendy presented at our last board meeting. A lot of the data points is if you can supply it at any level, it's actually going to in theory, advance what you're looking for in fair housing.
Right. And as a general note, I'm definitely not afraid to tell people things they don't want to hear. That's kind of my self-appointed role here. So you don't have to worry about that. And just in case it wasn't clear, to answer your question on a per unit basis, it absolutely almost always takes more housing credits to build a new unit than to rehabilitate an existing one. But you then have a new unit as opposed to rehabilitating where the unit is better, nicer shape, but it was there before and it's there after. And so that's the trade-off there. So the next question then becomes a little more challenging, and that's the notion of how you split the resource within the state. And so this was, among the various things discussed, a very hot topic with a very select set of people, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, the larger cities, who don't like that there are fewer 9% awards in their jurisdictions than they think is merited. And the rejoinder to that is they receive a tremendously greater amount of bond deals, to which they then respond, well, that may be true, but bond deals are of a certain nature. They're large, they can't be infilled, smaller, and they serve a higher income populations by necessity because they have more debt service, and they can't go down to the 50, 40, 30% AMIs anywhere near to the same extent that a 9% can. So that's the back and forth, and there's really no right answer. What in my travels, I've come to the conclusion that any attempt, and you would think what I'm about to say doesn't fit what you think would come from a policy person, as I very much think of myself, but I've come to the conclusion after all these years doing this work that an attempt to say, let's split it up based on need is nothing but an invitation to an argument. That's it. There's no way for any two, even, good-natured, informed, well-intentioned people to come to a conclusion as to which area has more need than another, because you can define it so many different ways, each way being perfectly legitimate and reaching completely different outcomes. And so that's why, and you can still do that though as an agency. You can just say, we're going to pick this as our definition of need, and that's it. And if you do, you just have to know there's another definition that's equally right that's going to come up with a different answer. And so that's why, as a policy person, it seems like a cop-out, but I generally like to say the way to split the resource is on a per capita basis. And the other support for that is that you get these resources on a per capita basis, both bonds and credits. They come to you as a state based on X dollars per person that you have that's in the Commonwealth. And so, yes, please.
You're muted, Kathy.
Well, while you're unmuting, Kathy, I got a question for the per capita basis. Would you say per capita based on sheer population, or are you per capita based on AMI needs?
Well, then that's one of those ways you can make that distinction. I tend to think that based on a straight per capita, just people, period, is the way to go. But it wouldn't have to do it that way. You could do it based on the number of people that are below 80%, 60%, 30%. You could pick a number.
And my question is, because everyone's subject to fair housing laws, is there a fair housing impact? Remembering that we have Hispanic populations, we have Black populations, we have female-headed households populations. I'm not only talking about race, but I don't want KHC to be vulnerable.
Well, I definitely don't either. That would be the last outcome that I would want, be to generate a fair housing concern. I don't see one based on splitting up the resources on a per capita basis. The bigger challenge to me is, even if you presume splitting up per capita, where do you draw the lines? How do you draw the boundaries? And there are also judgment calls to make even on that basis. And for related reasons, that has to do with potential scoring items. And what we're talking about now are set-asides. And all these things, set-asides, threshold criteria, and scoring, are all absolutely connected and related. You have to think about them as a collective. And for purposes of scoring, that we may get to, time permitting, is I think it makes sense to split the new and rehab based on the extent to which localities have their own resources to support affordable housing, so that Louisville isn't competing with Eastern Kentucky, for example, because Louisville has a lot of money that it receives directly from HUD and potentially even raise its own money, or at least it could, whereas Eastern Kentucky does not. And so projects in those two areas ought not to compete against each other. And that already happens to an extent now, but the idea would be to draw the boundaries such that there's an urban set aside and a rural set aside. And then the next question is, well, how you could make it even more refined. You could have urban, rural, urban, suburban, and rural, like they do in Ohio. And there's any number of ways you can carve up the resource, but the more you carve it up, the less meaningful the competition within each of those areas becomes. And so there's an inherent trade-off between having sizable amounts of resources for which you can have a robust competition and having it be specifically focused. And so within that continuum, within that range, I think you just kind of need to split the difference somewhat. So those are some initial thoughts there. That's really one of the biggest topics for this group in KHC to consider. So I want to pause for other questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, etc. from anybody. Okay. Well, so then the next topic, now we're shifting into scoring items. And so these are within the set-asides, however the credits get split up. Then there's the question of which projects are eligible, threshold criteria, which we aren't really covering because that's not as much of a thing in the QAP. Then among those, the question is, well, which ones get the award within the competition? And so that's this notion of scoring. And so the first of these is something that KHC has worked on and tried to do. To its credit, you're ahead of a lot of other states in attempting to have criteria to promote participation by disadvantaged parties. And so that is many other states haven't even begun trying that. Some others have. You're not alone in that regard, but you're definitely ahead. And so the question is, how has that attempt, how have those criteria worked out so far? And this came up less among the participants than it did with discussions with KHC, its staff itself. But there's some concerns about the extent to which the parties who have generated points under these criteria are going to meaningfully participate in the projects going forward. So that, as in, the intent is not necessarily being carried out by the developers. And so that happens all the time. You can, even if you were to look at this, I don't think it was by any means a total failure, but even if it were a total failure, okay. If you don't ever have anything go wrong, that's because the only way you have that happen is because you don't ever try. And so KHC tried something here, which is to its credit. You got to innovate, you got to attempt, you got to adapt, you got to try new things. And it seems like this maybe hasn't, and I think it's a little early yet, but it seems as though maybe this hasn't worked out quite as well as everyone has hoped. And so the question then, if that's the case, does it continue with the hope of it getting better, or do we make some type of change or amendment to maybe have a slightly different outcome? And so, again, I want to stop and pause because this is a very hot topic and important issue for KHC to consider going forward.
And Wendy, I wonder if you could explain the disadvantaged participants, what that entails, because as a phrase, I think I know from prior discussions what it means, but a little more definition of what that means.
I'm going to let Terry Helton explain that.
So for the disadvantaged participants, it is those that have the MIBI-WIBI, which is the minority-owned businesses, some that are veteran-owned businesses. So some of those will have certifications that they have, that they are in these particular disadvantaged groups. And so with that, we are trying to use that as a scoring item, that if you have a developer on your development team and they are a Meeby Weeby or veteran-owned businesses, that you would get these points for those. So we were trying to get those folks to come in, new developers that may not have the advantage of the experience that our other developers have. Hoping to get them involved in, new units out there, rehab units out there throughout the state. So that was part of the incentive to get them to come on board. Some of the problems I think we kind of ran into was they were saying that they were women-owned businesses, but they were not really developers within the state. So it kind of created a snowball effect of, well, not really a snowball effect, but it just kind of created a way to game the system, if you would, to gain those points. They would bring in businesses that really weren't developers. They weren't the candidates that we were really looking for. So it's kind of like, how do we now, do we continue the way that it is, or do we kind of tweak that to see what we can do to get the folks in here that we were actually looking for?
Another example, and this is a specific case, so I'm not saying it's across the board, but these points do give an advantage to a minority or women or veteran-owned business. And we have had one of those, get credits, started development, but really not have the breadth of experience. And we do require that they either have a partner or a consultant, but up until now, we have left it to them to meaningfully engage that partner or that consultant, and we're seeing that doesn't always happen. And I'll be honest with you, we are worried about a project in particular where a minority-led business developer might lose their project, in part because they weren't really meaningfully using a kind of a mentor, developer, or a consultant. We don't want that to happen either. So we want to keep moving in this direction. We're just trying to figure out, how do we do it meaningfully without being too restrictive or too rigid?
So what we want is for this to be able to develop capacity. And if they're in name only, or if the expertise is in name only, either side is in name only, then we're not achieving what our goal is. Well, yeah.
Well, absolutely.
And this comes up in other contexts. There's examples like in the federal government of attempts to promote participation by certain groups that results in partnerships that someone can question. And so this is not unique to our circumstance. It's just happening here. And I don't know that there is a good obvious answer, but we will need to come to some conclusions. Yeah, Barry, I don't know if you had a point.
No,
okay. Other thoughts on this? All right. Well, then, so if presuming that we go forward and really continue with what is effectively the current process, which is splitting the criteria between new and rehab, then the question becomes, well, what selection criteria do we have for the rehabilitation of existing housing? And there wasn't a great deal of input or concern about this. And so I don't have a particular thing to call out as saying needs attention or discussion. I will just add from my own personal perspective, I think it's great that KHC staff goes out and looks at the properties and comes up with their conclusion as to which ones have a greater need for rehabilitation. I think that is one of the best ways to assess and evaluate properties. And so I think that part already, and if anything, maybe that could become more consequential in the way the system works. And so, yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
And I don't know where this fits in, but I recall when KHC included that they weren't going to give extra points for high impact areas. And that, I assume, is continuing, that we like promoting whatever's happening in non-high impact areas. Is that a policy that's going to, Terry's or Wendy or Mark, going to continue? Did that fall to the wayside at some point?
It sounds like it's before my time, so maybe someone else could address it.
I'm not.
Kathy, maybe we might not be using the same terms. Tell us more about what you mean about high impact, or are you talking about like opportunity neighborhoods or?
I thought there was extra money, that the feds gave extra money for high impact areas, but KHC said in scoring and comparative scoring, we love it being in non-high impact areas.
When you mean high impact, do you mean already has a concentration of affordable housing or low income households?
In fact, I thought it was a federal definition of high impact areas, and you get more credit, get the possibility of more money per.
That term doesn't ring a bell.
Maybe
Are
qualified.
Oh my gosh! I may be, I may be way out of. I may be a decade outside of.
Mindy, I think you're on the right track with a qualified census tract or a difficult development area that
would fit.
Allows the applicant to get a boost in credits.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just using the wrong term.
It's okay. We got there.
Right. So those, so for anyone else that maybe is new or unfamiliar with the housing credit program, those are two types of areas defined within Section 42, which is the federal law governing the housing credit program, and it says that properties can get up to 30% of additional subsidy, totally artificially, based on being in either a high poverty census tract or and I'm summarizing here, effectively a low poverty zip code area. And so those are two ways that the property can get more resources. Now, just because it can get more resources doesn't mean that it will. That there are other reasons why a property can get a reduced amount of credits from what is its maximum possible, mainly being it doesn't need the additional resources. And so that's sounds like what Kathy was covering, and that the fact that properties can get more resources is itself an incentive for developers to do deals in those areas, especially bond deals. That makes a particular difference for those, since the amount of credits aren't capped.
But I thought KHC, and this is at least 10 or 12 years ago, that KHC actually gave competitive points if it wasn't I keep calling them high impact, concentrated poverty areas with a lot of rental house, because that's what was happening. Was you were just putting more rental and more low income housing in low income areas. So
yes, so we used the Opportunity 360 score. So what we did was, instead of penalizing projects located in those areas, we offered points for projects in higher opportunity communities, if you will. Terry, would you say I'm characterizing that correctly?
I think so, yes.
And that will continue.
Well, we're trying to that is one of the items on Mark's list, is because there's many upsides to that direction, and I've been a proponent of it. The downside is it's harder to get units built there. They cost more for land acquisition. They take a long time due to zoning and NIMBYism. And so I'm not saying we give it up, but we need units and we need them to get built, and so it is something we have to figure out. And no matter what, we're losing our metric that we used to use. So we've got to figure out what our new metric is for the high opportunity areas.
Indeed. So we could actually, really 5 and 6 are actually both related to this, effectively. But I don't want to move on prematurely. If anyone has any other thoughts or comments on the rehab selection criteria. The distance from awarded projects, it's yeah, Kathy, go ahead.
One more thing is, and then actually my list will be exhausted. More listening is we already use selection competitive points to say, oh, you have to follow the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act. Essentially, if you're getting low income housing tax credits and you don't live in a place that is covered by the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act, we give people extra protections. And I'm wondering if we can't even advance that further, like even protections that go beyond because we don't use the term uniform residential landlord tenant. If we can give even more protections to people, because then KHC becomes a leader even in areas that don't have many tenant protections. So, and honestly, that exhausts my list of all the things I wanted to raise. But I don't know if other jurisdictions do that. But I just would, see KHC as a leader towards tenant protection as well. So, and with that, that's really my list.
So the challenge with taking steps in that direction, and other agencies absolutely have gone beyond their state landlord tenant law, is you basically have to pick one of two routes, or you could try to combine them. The first route is to have extensive new changes to the way properties run their operations that would be substantial differences from existing practice. And so the agency can do that, but it can only do it going forward, because all the properties that have already received an award, it's kind of like you've struck your deal. You can't, one party of a contract can't retroactively say, oh, by the way, now this is what you have to do. That's just not the way contracts work, as we all know. And so what that then means is these new improvements only kick in starting a couple of years from now, and they don't have any consequence for the existing portfolio. And as a result, their impact is pretty tiny on a percent of tenants basis. And so that makes it seem almost more symbolic. I guess you could think of it as maybe long-term thinking, because eventually it'll catch up. But
right, because we did it 12 years ago. And so all the projects that went into these areas with no tenant protections now have cumulatively introduced those protections into those areas. Yeah, I understand that start small.
Well, and that's good. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people do when they make these sorts of arguments. They think, oh, we're striking a blow, we're making a big difference. Well, you're really not. You're making a small difference at some point in the future. By contrast, what you can do is have more incremental changes that you put not in the QAP, but in a compliance manual. And there's actually things that you can do as an agency in the compliance manual that are not really big changes, but may have a big effect. Like, for example, having owners understand the way criminal screening actually is supposed to work. There's a lot of owners who don't get it. They're still using arrest records to do criminal screening, which HUD says you're not allowed to do. They're still saying anyone with a felony at any point, regardless, they're out. We're not going to consider it. Again, HUD says you can't do that. You must do an individualized assessment of the felonies. And so that's just one example. Understanding of how reasonable accommodations work is another. A lot of owners don't know the way that law works. They think you just have to treat everybody the same. Well, no, if you do that, you're actually violating federal law in some cases.
And so we can use HUD rules, even though this is Treasury stuff.
Well, yes, because HUD enforces fair housing.
Site. It's a great site, and probably people conflate HUD and.
Yeah, HUD is responsible for enforcing fair housing. And so obviously there's various private actors that can do that, but from a federal perspective. So there are things like that and that agencies can do. You can also do things that are positive, like just have some form of encouragement for folks to do positive reporting of tenant rental payments, positive reporting for their credit history. That's something that agencies have done, and so that owners can start doing at any point, and with tenants opting in. So there are things like that you can do immediately across the board without without it being going too far to where you're really changing the deal on tenants. And so you wouldn't do that with the QAP because the QAP is only looking forward. So that's sort of outside of the subject matter of what we're covering today. But just wanted you to know that those are options potentially. So that would take us to distance to awarded projects. The idea here, you can say it's related to fair housing, but it's really more about lease up. The idea being that properties having been awarded need a chance to get finished and can complete their lease up before they have another property awarded near them. And that's something that does exist. Casey's certainly not alone in having that rule. But one critique of it is that it presumes a problem as opposed to allowing a market analyst to make that determination to see would there actually be a problem. There's also a notion of fairness of spreading out the resource. We've already given an award here, so that we should serve that area. But it's an incomplete consideration and it draws a pretty narrow boundary of what is served. And so that is something that came up as a critique from the outside parties. And as a former agency staff person, again, for a couple different states, the other thing I would think is, and certainly not asking for comments but I would think it'd be kind of a pain to administer, to do all this radius measuring and counting which projects are where. And so that I would think would take a lot of staff time, and I don't know that staff time is necessarily well spent for the outcomes that it achieves. And it also creates a risk if you measure it wrong, if you don't capture the right projects, that kind of thing. So that's something that whenever I work with states, I've discouraged using that kind of assessment for one that have instead considerations that are easier to implement and look a little broader. But that's just my personal opinion. So,
and I'll just say, because I had reason to do this, in like 40212 per square mile are like 3,000 people, whereas in way out East End is upscale, it's like 900 people per square mile. So distance itself doesn't really have the same meaning if people are crowded in or spread out. I'm with you on that.
And the criteria are different for urban and rural. It's half mile versus 3 miles, but that just is a whole other.
This is urban. This is considered our urban upscale area, right? Yeah.
Yep. So that was another one that came up within the selection criteria. So then the next is something. It's pretty rare that an agency has no choice but to change something that you're externally imposed upon you, that something's got to be new and different. And usually when it does, it's like for some political force that's above you on the state government org chart that's coming down from on high saying, yeah, this needs to be different. So what we've got is a really unique circumstance where KHC is one of multiple states, don't know how many, but it's at least 4 or 5 others that used Enterprise Opportunity 360 tool in its scoring process. And that's one of the reasons why Enterprise created the resource. But apparently they somehow thought they were going to make money on it. I don't know how they thought they were going to do that, but that was the hope when they created it. And I guess they didn't. And so they have now discontinued it. And so it's no longer available as a tool. So it's you can't keep go. You got to have something. You at least got to get rid of it. And the idea is that it was a good resource. No one that I can recall complained about it as a tool. But it's again, you got to, if you're going to have something that looks at potential applications that way, it would have to be a different resource. So in seeing this coming, KHC took the very wise step of signing up with another provider called PolicyMap, and they, as a way to at least have the option to create a replacement for this. And PolicyMap it's a fascinating service. They have data on every possible consideration that you could ever imagine. I mean, if you look them up, they can probably find your shoe size and every person that lives in your house. I mean, it's amazing how detailed it is. And it's actually kind of overwhelming. I don't know if you've heard the example of if you're at like a farmer's market and you walk up to a booth that has 200 options for jellies and jams, you'll just get overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. Whereas if they only offer 8, then I can pick. And so the ones that only offers 8 sells a lot more than the ones that offers 200 because people don't get overwhelmed. Well, PolicyMap is definitely the 200 kinds. It's just every possible kind of data that's out there. And so, which is good though, because so we have a lot of options from which to pick to do this sort of assessment. And then the other thing that we would need to do if we wanted to truly be like Opportunity 360 is then make those numbers available to our developers. And the ways you can do that are to have just lists in the QAP where you see census tract XYZ gets points 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. Or you can create an online mapping tool. Now that, though, is a whole other step that's not included with PolicyMap membership. That's another check to write to make that happen. But it would be a possibility. And so, but the bigger question, more important question, is which criteria of the many that are available do we take into consideration for doing this assessment? So that's going to be a question for us going forward, is what do we take into account? So we'll stop and pause there for thoughts on that. All right. Well, so then the next two are criteria that are in the QAP that have been there for at least several iterations of it that were universally unpopular within the feedback groups. And so they are the significant share of units and the percent of households below 60% of AMI. So the thought being that the way they do the assessment, that what they're meant to achieve doesn't really accomplish what they're supposed to achieve, and that they create incentives for developers that don't align with what KHC probably really wants. That, as in, two competing properties that are very similar in every way, except one just happens to be in a county that has a lot fewer people, has a big advantage over the one that doesn't. And it is tough to see how that would matter as from a policy or real estate perspective. And so it does seem like we could change those and maybe have a different approach that is a little more in line with what KHC really wants to achieve. But even if KHC was perfectly satisfied and happy with these two, and they were kind of lukewarm out in the field as opposed to being disliked, it would still make sense to change them anyway. Because in my opinion, it's good for agencies to mix up these selection criteria every few years. Because if you don't, then you end up encouraging people to go to the same places over and over again. And so you just never know, by coming up with something new and different, maybe you'll have some neat new outcome, neat new benefit that is just a better way to do it. So I think it's important to change and evolve. These are two opportunities to do that. Yeah, Wendy.
And I would just add, Mark, if we can land on an appropriate replacement for Opportunity 360 through PolicyMap, that might negate the need, particularly for the percentage of households under 60% AMI, like we're getting to opportunity that's kind of a duplicative category. And then regarding, we have had a preference for not locating new projects near existing projects under development. That's that significant share of units. We do require a market study that gets to market share. And we want to just get more units almost everywhere, anywhere we can. So probably don't want to put up a roadblock that might not be necessary. And I say this as someone who helped craft some of these criteria in the past. So I'm just owning that they might not be the right fit now.
And Wendy, because you have convinced this very urban person about the differences in the state, 60% of area median income isn't great for East Kentucky.
No,
because it's what is it? It's the difference between Le Royale and the Quarter Pounder. I don't know if it's Pulp Fiction. Right? It's like absolutely huge numbers of people and percentages of people have incredibly low incomes in some of these areas, but that just brings down the AMI. Yeah. So, you've made me very, it's not like I didn't know, but you've made me sensitive to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. Well, and that's really all I had to cover. And I know that we've got 10 minutes left here in our scheduled time. I didn't know exactly how engaged we would be in the discussion. So could certainly try to think of some others if you want, but or other general questions, issues, topics. I'll turn it over to Terry and Wendy as to what else we want to cover here with our time available.
I'll confess, I don't really understand 360. So I don't understand what we lost or what we
got
wanted.
it. Sorry. Yeah, my
that's
apologies.
Okay. I would. Oh no, because I'm too shy to ask.
No, it's just me having is what's called assumed knowledge, and I shouldn't have assumed. Yeah. So what happened is it's a national entity. It's Enterprise Community Investment. They do a lot of different things. One of them is they're an equity syndicator. So, but they also have other lines of business and a whole policy team. And so they, several years ago, came up with this notion, this Opportunity 360, maybe been a decade ago. And so what it did, used to use in the past tense, is by census tract would look at different data points. And so it would be, and they had them grouped in 5 different categories. I don't know if I can remember all 5 of them, but housing and healthcare, educational attainment, transit was one of them. And so, and it picked publicly available data for those different categories and came up with a score. And so, and then and there were scores within each of the 5 categories, and then there was an overall score. And the purpose of it was to say, to what extent would someone growing up here have opportunities? That's the idea. And so if you're in a area with really high life expectancy, really high educational attainment, a lot of transit, very low poverty, then the idea being you have a lot of opportunity by living in that area. So the point being that would help agencies to figure out how to award their resources to do more developments in those census tracts so as to create more opportunity for folks. And or by contrast, to avoid areas that are really bad on those same metrics. And I think Kentucky did like I did when I was helping Kansas and ignored some of them, like transit. At least in Kansas, when we did because that was another state where I worked, and we used Opportunity 360. We only used 3 of the 5 criteria, I think. Maybe it's 4 out of the 5. But I know we didn't use transit because, in Kansas, there is hardly any transit anywhere, so it wasn't worth measuring. But if you were using the 360 score in the New York metro area, then you would want to use transit because that'd be a big consideration. And so that's what's now gone that we need to replace. But again, a key component of it was anyone on the planet could go and pick on the website and just go zero into their census tract and find out what their score was. It was the most computer illiterate person practically could figure out how to do that. So it was really easy to do, which that was a great feature of it as well.
Yes, and in our scoring, we did the same, Mark. We just did 3 of those
got it.
categories, and it was like the housing stability, education, economic stability, or security. So we only used 3.
Very good.
So we are hoping that we can utilize Policy Map, so somehow going forward to replace that Opportunity 360.
Oh, sure. So Wendy, could you send to Terry? I sent this morning the kids count.
Yeah, sure. And just to frame this up with you all, because the QAP will come back to this committee for formal review and formal recommendation to the larger KHC board, we wanted you all in this session, but also if you want to, in follow-up, offer kind of thoughts or feedback as we shape this, we wanted to offer that opportunity early rather than only having you look at it after we felt like it was pretty cooked.
Right.
Yeah, we need to digest. I appreciate that.
Well, it certainly will shorten the board meeting now that I've got to ask all my questions.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? Go ahead, Barry.
No, go ahead, Terry. You still have the floor.
No, I was just asking if anybody had any other questions or comments.
Well, I'm still interested in the compliance and in the QAP of forwarding tenants' rights. So however it shakes down, that'll be an area that I continue to be very interested in, because I think we can do some good in the state.
Mm-hmm. I'll offer one more thing that might interest you, Kathy, and other committee members. We have met a bunch, I think every single one of my departments met recently to talk about kind of tying some of our work together. And we have been working our homeless programs as well as our Section 8 voucher program have been working on a platform called Padmission. It's where we get landlords to load their units, whether they're available or not. They can kind of turn them on or off to show that it's vacant. For landlords that are willing to accept a voucher, rapid rehousing, home TBRA, and the like, we're trying to kind of get more and more landlords in there, and we let our continuum of care members and our special Section 8 vouchers. It's limited to those folks now because we don't have a ton of landlords in there yet. It's a way to try to link tenants with available units that are willing to take that voucher instead of going on a wild goose chase trying to find. One of the things we are beginning to talk about is, do we make it a requirement that when our existing properties and our future funded properties, they give us data, ideally it's supposed to come every month or every quarter, on all of their units and which are occupied and all of that kind of stuff. Well, our tax credit properties are supposed to accept vouchers. At a minimum, the housing choice voucher, they have to by code. We'd like for them to be open to others. And so can we look at, in the QAP, incentivizing some 30% of area median income and below, so our lowest income Kentuckians, as well as getting our developers on a platform so that they can get linked up with a tenant who's got a rent subsidy and got hopefully some case management. It is a long-term goal, but we're really trying to work toward that, where we are, when they send us the data they already send us for compliance, we just load it into the platform de facto. We're working on it. We're trying to map out how we could make it easier and kind of a one-step process for our property management companies.
And I will add, if an agency wants to be creative, or what some might consider to be aggressive, is to give points in the QAP to developers who are able to make changes to their existing properties practices.
We talked about that.
Exactly. So you can do that. And now, depending on what you do along those lines, it could make developers really mad because they could think either I got my choice if I don't get my new deal funded, or I got to change the way I do business. And they could get all up in arms about that.
It also creates a new workload for our compliance team of having to go back. But we are at such a crisis point that it may be worth all of the upset that it could cause.
Yep.
And it wasn't on here, but I'm presuming that energy efficiency.
Oh yeah.
Will a type of housing. I know Barry. That will be interested in the new kinds of non-chattel housing, or even chattel housing if it's rental. But I hardly think we're going to create mobile home parks. But all those things will remain points, right, Terry? And yeah.
I can tell you that we are beginning to see some innovative construction approaches coming in. For the Rural Housing Trust Fund, we have a project that's partnering with Clayton Homes in West Kentucky to get housing to market. And then one of the projects that has applied through the 9% QAP innovation round is doing a version of modular construction, proposing it in Louisville. So we are beginning to see some movement on that. Hopefully it'll just grow.
Yes.
Yeah, and we as a species are way behind on that front. I mean, you think about how many professions could you take someone from literally the Middle Ages to now and have that person be able to work? But if you were to take a brick mason from the 1100s to a modern day site, they could start working. And that's just not true for anything else we do as a species. So clearly we're behind. Something we've got to give. I don't know if manufactured housing is it, but it might be. Something needs to be. Maybe it's 3D printed housing. They're making that work some places. But
I think it's all options, all ways to get quality housing to market.
And rooftop solar or some, kinds of things that help with utility costs and efficiency, because we want energy efficiency, but also utility costs, because we're dealing with people with low incomes. And I know they almost are entirely individually metered. Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really appreciate y'all listening to me ramble on about all this, and we'll be available for questions and comments going forward.
Mark, it was greatly informative, so I appreciate that.
Certainly happy to do it.
So
thanks to everyone for making time this morning. Really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, with that, I'm assuming that we're finished with your segment, Terry, and we'll move on. Is there any other items from the staff of the board that need to be addressed?
I just want to know, now we just wait till we see something. Is that?
Yes. Yeah, we'll be putting together some of our thoughts and ideas and where we want to go, and then we'll present that. We'll get a public forum, whether virtual or in person, and let our developers, our partners, see what our ideas are. They won't be the ones that are set in stone, but at least get their feedback of the direction that we're going.
Great. So, anything else? Well, with that silence, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And do we have a second on that, PG?
I'm not sure if PG's still on.
Well, technically we have a second.
I'll give a second.
Well, we got one. Good deal. Well, I'm assuming everybody's in favor of that. So we look forward to seeing you guys in person very shortly.
Thank you all for having me. I've learned quite a bit.
Sounds good,
much.
Man. Appreciate you being on. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.